Muchísimas gracias a todos por su tiempo. It is an honor to be here. Lo siento, pero voy a hablar en inglés porque soy poco más inteligente en inglés. Lo siento. My name is Matt Pedley, and I am from Blackstone. Blackstone is a small startup alternative asset manager. We are celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. What began as Steve Schwarzman and his partner Pete Peterson each putting in $200,000 back in 1985 is now grown to $1.2 trillion of assets under management. And the bulk of that is in the major asset classes of real estate, credit, private equity. We're the largest owner of commercial real estate in the world. We're the largest third-party credit business in the world, and we're the largest private equity platform in the world. So that gives us some pretty unique insights into what's happening across asset classes in the world of investing. And what I'd like to do today is share with you some of what we're seeing and where we're leaning in, and in some cases leaning out from various opportunities. So I mentioned some numbers, over $1.2 trillion of assets under management, but more valuable than just the money in the ground is the data, the insights that we get from this portfolio. We have over 260 operating companies in private equity. We have almost 13,000 real estate assets around the world. We lend money to over 5,000 different companies across all different sectors. This gives us an enormous amount of data coming in every week, every month, every quarter. We synthesize that data, we bring it together, and we draw conclusions from it. And that allows us to spot patterns early. And then when we see a trend, a theme that we have true conviction in, we go all in. And we put massive amounts of capital behind it across every different asset class. And so the things that I'm going to talk about today are things that we're investing in across asset classes. They're not just limited to private equity or credit or real estate. Let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. Back in 2010, as the global financial crisis was winding down and the recovery was beginning, we started to make a major bet into warehouses. This was really just a basic economic recovery theme that we were playing behind, that as the economy recovered, warehouses would by nature get dragged along with that. What we saw was something unexpected. These companies did well, really well, much better than we were forecasting. This is a pleasant surprise to be sure, but it still made us ask why. Why are these warehouses doing so well? Well, the reason didn't have as much to do with just the general economic recovery. That was a small part of it. But the real story was the move to e-commerce. And that in an electronic commerce world, warehouses became a critical part of the story because you needed to ship packages out to individuals, and the warehouses were the halfway house, the holding point for that. And so warehouses became much more valuable. And as we started to see this trend coming, because of the data we were getting, we did a major shift. And you can see right now about 40% of our real estate portfolio is in logistics. So when we find a theme where we have strong conviction, because that's what our data tells us, we invest at major scale. And oftentimes this also tells us what to avoid. For example, back in 2007, you can see almost 2/3 of our real estate portfolio was in U.S. office buildings. And what we started noticing as we were evaluating new deals was that the return on equity for all of the improvements that were having to be made the deals just very unattractive. And so we really pulled back from U.S. office before COVID. 2 years before COVID, we were really dialing back our exposure to U.S. office, and we were selling those assets at great prices because not everyone had the data that we saw. Now, today, U.S. office represents 1.5% of our portfolio. ironically, we are starting to go back in to office. We're starting to see really compelling values out there because everyone's abandoned that sector of the market. So this ability to use data and dynamically adjust the portfolio is incredibly important. One of the questions that I get a lot, I've been in the private equity business, broadly speaking, for over 20 years, isn't there too much money in private assets broadly, and aren't returns going to come down? By the way, I've been hearing this for the last 20 years, every year. The answer has been no for each of the last 20 years, and the answer is no today. Some simple math as to why our conviction is so high for private markets. If you look at, I'm going to use private equity as an example because that's what I'm closest with, but it's true across asset classes. The number of companies around the world of any scale, meaning more than $250 million, 86% of all companies in the world that are $250 million in revenue or higher are private. Public companies represent 14. So there are 5 times as many private companies as there are public companies. The number of public companies, in fact, has shrunk. If we look over the last 30 years or so, it's become much more difficult to become a public company. In the US, we've had regulations, se llama Sarbanes-Oxley y otros. It's very painful to be public. If you compare this to the values out there, if you look at the total value of private equity assets out there, it's about $5 trillion. If you look at the total market cap of public equities, it's about 120 trillion. So 5 trillion versus 120 trillion. So public equity markets have 24 times the value, even though private markets have 5 times the TAM, 5 times as many companies. Where do we think the possibility for too much money chasing too few deals is? The math is obviously tilted towards the private markets being an attractive place, and they will continue to be an attractive place. And by the way, this is just in the frame of private equity. If you look across all alternatives, there's about $13 trillion in private assets in alternatives, compared to an addressable market of about $300 trillion. So we're talking about 3% market penetration. Lots and lots of room to grow for private markets. We are incredibly bullish about the opportunity. And in private equity alone, I look at what we've seen. If you look at year-over-year growth, our companies are growing at an 8% revenue rate. EBITDA is growing at 18% year-over-year. This is across a big portfolio of companies. The new deals that we're looking at, we use the number of non-disclosure agreements, and we sign. In September, we signed 250% more of those NDAs than we did back in January. So deal activity is really picking up as interest rates fall, as IPO markets open. And again, there are 5 times as many companies with 1/24 the overall value. So we feel terrific about the opportunity in private markets today. And if you're not using private markets in your portfolio, I would encourage you to give a long, hard look. Most U.S. institutions are running about 35% of their portfolios in private markets. And the ones with longer time horizons, like university endowments, are typically in the 45 to 50% range. Major themes that we're seeing, and we're going to dive more into most of these. Digitization, you can see there's an 11 times increase in global network traffic. In data, there's over 100 times the amount of data created, huge increases in the amount of power. Franchisers are growing faster than non-franchise businesses, a massive funding gap in the life sciences. So I want to dive into each one of these because each one of these creates opportunities across asset classes, and this is where we're really focused. We're going to boil these down into 4 major categories, and then there are a couple other things I'll talk about at the end. AI. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. I think it might be important. Just a hunch. Power. Fewer people have heard of the vast need and secular growth going on in the power sector, but I want to talk about that because it's critically important. The digital economy. More and more things are going online. And then finally, the massive innovation that's happening in life sciences and the opportunities to invest behind that in a safe way, not like a venture capital gambling sort of way. Okay, let's talk about the first one, AI. Everyone's been bombarded with AI. It's all we hear about on the news, et cetera. We have a big history here. Our founder, Steve Schwarzman, has donated hundreds of millions of dollars to Oxford and MIT for their AI programs. Where we have chosen to primarily make our investments is not backing the hot new AI startup. It's not backing even the big large language model players, although we do have some small investments in those. What we're really trying to do is find a safer way to invest money behind the AI megatrend. You're going to hear me reference this style of investing a lot. It's the first derivative approach. Rather than investing in the thing, invest in the first derivative of the thing that will naturally get pulled along, but where valuations are going to be a lot more sane. And that is precisely what we're doing here. Number one first derivative in AI is data centers. We are the largest data center owner in the world. We started investing in data centers before the big AI revolution took off. Why? Because of the massive increase in data. There has been 100 times increase in the amount of data created, consumed, stored since 2010. And in fact, 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. Let me put that another way. In the last 2 years, we've created more data than in all of recorded history before that. This trend line's only going in one direction. Ignore this at your peril. Data centers have become the lifeblood for storing data, moving data around, processing data, and now training AI models. And so there is a 16% increase in new leasing of data centers to meet all this demand. And it's not only from AI, it's cloud computing, it's content creation, it's the digitization of the global economy. Think of everything you do online. ChatGPT, just to put a point on the AI aspect of this, ChatGPT reached 700 million users in less than 2 years. That is faster than any other software application ever. Think of Facebook, YouTube, anything you can imagine. They all took 2 to 5 times as long to reach that level of user penetration. So the things are happening faster than ever in this world. And the amount of money, CapEx, that's going into data centers is just enormous. It's largely driven by hyperscalers, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, Meta, or Facebook, Amazon. CapEx is up 4 times since 2021, so 4x in 4 years, and it's continuing to grow. So this we refer to as the picks and shovels. We're not mining for the gold, we're selling picks and shovels to the people that are mining for the gold. It's an arms race out there between these companies. We prefer to be an arms dealer rather than to take sides on all this. Speaking of which, the largest data center provider in the world, a little company called QTX. We bought QTS for $10 billion back in 2021. So we've owned it for a little less than 4 years. It's grown its lease capacity 10 times in the last 4 years. 10x in 4 years. It's the fastest growing data center provider in the world. We bought another company called AirTrunk in Asia. That brings our portfolio to over $100 billion of leased properties. You'll notice this little point in the middle, 100% pre-leased developments. What does that mean? It means before we start pouring concrete, before we start building a data center, 100% of that data center's capacity is leased, generally to Microsoft, Amazon, Google, et cetera. That lowers the risk profile very significantly. I would not build a data center on spec. That feels like a much riskier proposition. But if you can generate a mid-teens return, taking the credit risk of a Microsoft or Google or Oracle or Amazon, that feels pretty good. And so, again, we identify a trend and we invest at scale. And these data centers are fabulous because what does a data center really provide? It doesn't provide computing power. When we lease a data center, we're providing the shell of the building, power, backup systems, and cooling. So it's not that complex. The tenants, for every dollar they spend to lease the actual space, they'll put $3 to $4 in hardware, computing power, fiber optic cables, et cetera. The tenants are bearing the technological obsolescence risk of this. And so, these contracts are typically very long dated, anywhere between 10 and 20 years. So we find this to be a spectacular investment overall. And of course, we've invested across asset classes. We have invested in the data centers themselves, in companies that supply power to the data centers, in companies that supply the backup systems and power conditioning. You actually have to clean the electricity going in so it's a very smooth signal and no noise. Cooling for these data centers, and then data storage, networking, and equipment. We did an amazing deal. This company called CoreWeave. I don't know if you can see this here. This was a company that we found. They were actually a Bitcoin miner, and we're not going to invest in a Bitcoin miner. We don't get involved in crypto. But they had an opportunity to become a value-added reseller of a small chip company called NVIDIA. And what they needed was $1.5 billion to buy NVIDIA chips so that they could package them and then lease out those boards to Microsoft, was one of their biggest customers, but the hyperscalers. And it provided a way for those hyperscalers to scale more efficiently. We were able to structure a deal with these guys where we supplied the capital and we isolated that such that we got first lien on the payments. So the payments coming in from their contracts with these hyperscalers went directly to us first, and we got paid back. So this was effectively a structured credit that included a little bit of coverage on the back end as well. And so we were able to generate mid-teens returns without leverage, high teens returns with leverage, again, for taking the implicit credit risk of will Microsoft pay its bills, its contracted bills. That feels like a good investment. These are some of the ways, again, first derivative ways that we've been able to take advantage of the AI revolution. So this has been enormous, and it's going to continue to be a big driver, but you have to be smart about it. And I think doing things like pre-lease data centers or these structured credits where you're getting paid terrific returns for taking very high quality credit risk, that feels like a smart way to do it. Another first derivative of the AI revolution is power. Everyone knows about AI. Power is not on everyone's radar just yet. We're fine with that because we've been able to get very cheap valuations in this space. This is an amazing place to be putting money to work. The power consumption rate has basically been flat for the last couple decades in the United States. Population has been growing, but things have been getting more efficient, and so you can see the net result is it's basically been flat. Now it's growing at about 4% per year. I realize that doesn't sound like a lot, 4% per year. It's transformative. The U.S. electrical grid was designed and built in the 50s and 60s. I guarantee you, when this transmission grid was built, no one was thinking about everyone coming home from work at 6 at 6 o'clock at night and plugging their car into the wall. No one was thinking about a data center that consumed the power of a small city because they were trying to create artificial general intelligence. These things were never in the design plan. So there's a massive need for build-out across the power ecosystem. You think about things like a ChatGPT query. I've done about 6 of these today. A ChatGPT query takes 10 times the power of a regular Google search. If you want to have an AI tool like DALL-E make a picture for you, that uses 50 times the power of a Google search. If you want to use a tool like Sora to create an AI-generated video, 10,000 times the power of a typical Google search. These things are happening all the time. So you can see why there's so much demand for power. There's $4 trillion of projects in the queue. This is just in the US. And so just like these other megatrends, we're investing across the entire power ecosystem. We're investing in power plants. We're investing in battery storage systems to help smooth out intermittence like solar and wind. We're investing in transmission lines, distribution networks, utilities, components like the insulator discs required for any time a wire goes in and out of a substation, consulting and services type companies. High growth rate, and again, there's not a ton of competition here, and so you can generate private equity plus type returns in these. Great. I've just been told we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to be very quick. Digital economy, you're all familiar with this. More and more things are happening online, so marketplaces and logistics. We talked about logistics before. Again, a first derivative play on the digital economy. Life sciences, another area where there's incredible innovation. Most people aren't familiar. Drugs are getting easier to develop, in part because of AI tools that can model protein folding. And to get these drugs to market still requires the same process that's been around for the last 50 years. It takes $2.6 billion to create a new medicine and get it approved. And so we're investing in companies that help manage those processes, and then we're also increasingly financing, we have a separate strategy, financing big drug companies for their phase 3 trials. This is off-balance sheet lending to major drug companies, and again, you can generate private equity style returns, 20+% returns on very good credit risk. I'm going to speed through this. The secondary markets are on fire right now. All of you are probably familiar with the low DPI environment. Cash hasn't been coming back for the last couple of years. I think that'll change as interest rates come down. I know it will change. But a lot of people need to rebalance their portfolios, and so we are seeing amazing discounts in the secondary market. And record volumes. This year will be another record volume, probably over 200 billion in markets traded. The last thing, housing is a tremendous opportunity. You know, in the U.S., it's on average 45% more expensive to rent a house than to buy a house versus renting the equivalent house. So that creates a huge opportunity. We are loading up on rental housing. That's going to persist for quite some time. And then the final one I want to talk about, which is another one that most people are underinvested in, is the enormous opportunity in India. India has 1.3, 1.4 billion people. It's number one fastest growing economy in the world. It's about 6.5% in real terms, about 12% nominal. Fourth largest economy in the world after US, Japan, China. We've been there for 20 years, and it is our best performing country in the world for private equity. It has been that for the last 15 years, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. You can see the GDP growth has been very solid. Market cap has continued to grow up. GDP per capita is growing. That's driving a ton of internal domestic growth. And what most people don't recognize is if you just look at public markets, India is the only major market that has done better than the United States over the last 20 years and over the last 5 years. Deep public markets that are highly actionable, and like any good private equity, we've been able to deliver significant premiums in returns to these high public market returns. It's our number one performing country out there. Most people have little to no exposure to India. Again, ignore this one at your peril. This is a terrific environment. Am I out of time? Do you want questions and answers? That's it. Oh, that's it. Okay.
Muchísimas gracias a Matthew por esta presentación y es momento de dejar con ustedes a Drew Snow del área de estrategia de inversiones cuantitativas para clientes de Harbour Best, quien nos va a hablar de los fondos Evergreens. Welcome. Do you have only 20 minutes?
20 minutes, no problem. Try to keep us on time here. How's everyone doing? It's good? Great conference so far? It's been fantastic. I feel so honored to be here with you. I came down from Boston. It's absolutely gorgeous here. It's a world-class city. And all of this conversation around reform and pensions, innovation, really focusing on the experience of the affiliates is near and dear to my heart. I spent my entire career kind of focusing on these issues. For 16 years, I worked for a large public investment house in Boston, and we focused on how to bring alternatives and better outcomes to target date funds through the use of alternatives. 6 years ago, I joined HarborVest and joined our quantitative investment science team, using data and tools and really focusing on working with institutions around the world on how to get the most out of their alternatives program. And then a year ago, I was asked to be the portfolio manager for one of our evergreen strategies. And so I've been doing that. And so this talk today is going to bring together a lot of that collective experience, because we're going through a lot of change today. First, I'm going to talk a bit about private markets and alternatives and how they can drive better outcomes for the affiliates and for workers and for retirees. Second, this is one of the biggest innovations that we've seen within alternatives, and that is the advent of the evergreen structure, and it's a complete game changer. And so I'll talk a little bit about why that is, some of the things to watch out for, and where we might be headed. And then last, we'll talk specifically about target dates, which has been such a focus of our conversation here today, and how evergreen structures are uniquely well suited for the future arc of the innovation within target date funds, and will create better outcomes for affiliates and beneficiaries. So I'm going to do all of that in about 18 minutes. I'll keep us on time. And first, I'll talk about a little bit, why are we here? Why are we even talking about alternatives? And you heard a little bit from my friend from Blackstone around some of these ideas, but there's kind of 5 key reasons for why alternatives can really shape outcomes for retirees. Number one is that if you look at the data, whether it's academic research or a lot of the work that has been done, if you have a well-constructed alternatives program that is mature and you're selecting investments wisely and you give it enough time, that there's a significant performance premium associated with alternatives. Number two, one of the reasons why there is such strong performance is that unlike in the public markets, the managers themselves are active owners of the business. They're bringing skills and expertise that are highly specialized in driving value over time in these companies. Number three is diversification. If you look at the composition of the public markets, and you heard some examples earlier, you're accessing very different types of companies that you find in the public markets, and people are increasingly concerned about the concentration of public markets. And in fact, in the S&P 500, large caps, there are 10 companies that comprise 40% of that index. So there's concerns about the level of concentration within public markets. 4 is just the expansive opportunity set afforded to alternatives and the ability to access different types of complementary companies. And 5 is the resiliency. And so last Friday was a reminder of how fickle public markets can be, where you saw China and the US going back and forth on trade policy and public markets selling off by 5%. Public markets tend to extrapolate future trends. They're being very sensitive to shifts in news, and you have a lot of buyers and sellers. Private markets tend to be much more gradual in how they change portfolio values, especially in times of panic. And that resiliency allows for the compounding of capital over time. So let's just take a little peek at the data here. And I could show you lots of different charts, and this is just one snapshot that looks over the last 20 years. The bottom is looking at risk, and here we've actually de-smoothed it. And relative to whether it's the S&P 500, global markets, small caps, if you look at the returns on the other axis here, you can see that buyouts and secondary and other alternatives historically have significantly outperformed, delivering measurable return premium with less volatility. Again, you think about how that can shape outcomes in a retirement system if you give it enough time. If you take a 20% allocation to private equity in a 70-30 portfolio, 70% equities, 30% bonds, on average, over cycles, you're adding 60 to 120 basis points of return, and compounding that year in and year out can really make a significant difference. You also heard a little bit about the expansive opportunity set. There's lots of ways to frame this data. This is one that looks at companies around the world that are greater than $15 million in revenue, and you take all of those companies, only 4% of those are represented in the public markets. 4 times as many are owned by private equity, and a lot more room to run, certainly in terms of those that are not in either camp. And importantly, you're seeing increased exposure to these businesses, but there's a concern about, is there too much capital coming into private markets? But let me just give you one little factoid, that if you take the entirety of the buyout, growth equity, and venture capital, all the money that's in the ground in unfunded capital, add all of that together, that amount is still less than the Magnificent Seven. So still relatively small with a lot of room to grow. But historically, exposure to alternatives has really been in the purview of institutions that have the size and scale and sophistication and long-term time horizon and need for returns. And you can see areas like family offices, endowments, and foundations have had the largest share of exposure to alternatives for all of these various reasons and have looked to expand that over time. And I would argue that as we're seeing more and more innovation within alternatives, there is more room to grow and to provide access to a broader swath of investors. And so that really shifts us into some of the innovation that we're seeing within private markets, and that is the advent of the evergreen structure. And I would argue for all of the innovation from an investment standpoint that we've seen within illiquid assets, we saw no change in the traditional structure since the early 1980s in terms of raising capital, investing that capital, and returning that capital over time. Incredibly cumbersome, and we'll get into some of the details in a moment. But what the evergreen structure has enabled investors to do is to have access to that same well-diversified private equity program that drives those great returns and lowers risk, but have it in a single fund. And typically an evergreen structure will have hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that are well-selected and mature and provide that exposure on day one. We're seeing evergreen structures complement traditional ways of getting alternatives and having that core exposure relative to using drawdown funds to get specialized types of exposures to areas that investors can then select, whether that's venture capital, whether that's smaller companies, whether it's highly specialized GPs. We're also seeing this embrace of operational complexity and ease within evergreen structures. And that frees up time for institutions to focus on those drawdowns, selecting those drawdowns where they can really make a difference and be very focused on those. And then also evergreen funds, by absorbing a lot of that complexity and continuously reinvesting capital over time, provide the continuous exposure that's necessary to compound returns. I think, as we all know, it is time in the market and being exposed, and to be able to do that on their own. And then also having drawdown funds that can complement evergreens in terms of having capital that can go into new deals. And so increasingly we're seeing institutions around the world embrace this concept of how do I marry up the traditional ways of accessing alternatives with evergreen funds. And here, just to level set what we mean by traditional private equity and evergreen, the ways in which illiquid assets operated for the initial 40 years of their lives is effectively raising a fund, calling that capital gradually over time, over a 5-year period. You can have 10, 20, 30 different calls take place. You have to guess effectively at what is that exposure going to look like in year 5 to figure out how much of a commitment do I want there. And you can have 30 to 50 different transactions take place as those companies realize value and that cash is being distributed back. That is an enormous amount of complexity and guesswork that is required to maintain a well-diversified traditional private equity program. This is just one fund. Imagine if you have 5 funds, 10 funds, 15 funds, 20 funds. The evergreen structure is designed to be a pool of existing assets where it's a single allocation, continues to reinvest over time and compound capital, and provide that opportunity for liquidity at demand, on demand. And so these evergreen funds were really surgically developed to address a number of the pain points associated with traditional ways of accessing illiquid assets. Number one, it provides a lot of flexibility to subscribe or to invest on a regular basis. There are typically monthly windows in which capital can be added in. And then one of the traditional pain points of private equity is I don't have any control in terms of when that cash gets back. I cannot access it, and so the ability to redeem on a regular basis is a significant unlock for the use of illiquid assets. Number 2 is around exposure management. As I mentioned before, it can take 5 years until you get peak exposure within the traditional format of private assets. It often takes over 10 years to develop a mature private equity program using traditional private equity. Here you can get it on day 1 in terms of exposure management. Operational complexity, the dozens of different funds, all of that complexity, the selection, the administration, all of it is within a single structure. We call that a turnkey solution. One of the other challenges associated with the traditional ways of getting private equity is this idea that you make a commitment and it hangs out there like a liability and ultimately gets drawn and invested. If you maintain a program of primary commitments over time, what happens is that amount of unfunded as a percentage of the amount of capital that you have invested on average is around 40%. That is a lot to consider. And then oftentimes from a regulatory standpoint, that unfunded, even though it is not invested and is a liability, can count against your targets. And so it's not a very efficient use of capital. There are no such thing as unfunded commitments in the context of an evergreen structure. And then there's also, how do I even think about performance in the context of evergreen funds? That has been solved. And so on a monthly basis, you get time-weighted returns. You have a level of transparency that is not available through the traditional mechanisms of getting private equity performance. And so having a real sense of what that value is and what the actual returns are has been a significant enhancement within evergreen funds. And so where are we seeing? There's been a wide range of adoption. You can see there's broadening demand. We have regulators around the world who are really rethinking, how do I think about alternatives exposure now that there's more liquidity, now that there's built-in diversification. And so whether it's the US pension fund use, you heard President Trump say, we're going to do this. We're going to provide access to our retirees in the 401k market in the US, in the UK, in Europe, around the world, throughout Latin America, really thinking about how do we use evergreen funds as a tool to kind of really help create better outcomes for the beneficiaries. Number 2 is that a lot of people think of evergreen funds as something that is just the domain of retail investors. And of course, they're the ones who struggle to get access most. But what we're seeing on a global basis is that it's not just retail. There's all different types of structures, and institutions increasingly are embracing this notion of evergreen funds. And in fact, they're even saying, hey, even if I have a separate account within private markets, how do I bring evergreen technology to outsource more and more of what I'm doing in my overall strategy? So a lot of these features are being adopted across the board, especially at the institutional level. Number two is we're seeing a lot of innovation. As I mentioned, we went through a 40 or 50-year period with basically zero innovation, and we're seeing all sorts of different partnerships around the world, traditional asset managers and private equity managers coming together, all different types of features within evergreens so that they can be tuned to the needs of retirement plans and asset owners and individuals around the world. And so there's an abundance of choice and innovation that we have not seen before. We're also seeing growing sophistication in terms of how do I combine different evergreen strategies together to create good outcomes? How do I combine drawdown funds with evergreen funds and make them work together in harmony? And lastly, we are seeing the growing pains of evergreen funds. And what is happening is that you have so much demand for these funds that represent net new sources of capital. There are people that are wondering actively right now, what does this mean for the whole alternatives ecosystem? What does it mean in terms of the availability of co-investment deal flow? What does this mean to secondary discounts? What does this mean to valuations overall? And we think also we have not been through kind of the perfect storm type of event where these have really been stress tested. And so there's increasing focus on what does this mean for institutions. There's not been the stress test in terms of what kind of liquidity management practices are being followed, how sophisticated are those, is there enough quality deal flow to sustain good returns? And so there will be an increasing level of dispersion across evergreen strategies as we look into the future. So the last chapter is really thinking about target date fund design and how to optimize those outcomes for beneficiaries throughout the entire glide path. And so when we look to partner with different institutions around the world, we come back to the sort of simple 4 key considerations. Number one is what kind of a return am I trying to target? And then what level of volatility or downside risk am I willing to tolerate? The longer the runway, the more time, the higher that return, and that shrinks down as you get closer and closer to retirement. Number two is what are those liquidity needs? The need for cash flow over time continues to escalate as you have more and more liabilities and you get closer to that retirement period. And what we're seeing too within a lot of the illiquid assets is that liquidity can be cyclical. And so how do I access liquidity on a more proactive basis? 3 is around time horizon and what is my measurement time? How long can I ride out the volatility? And then number 4 is around other considerations. What do I have in terms of investment staff? What are my skill sets? How do I bring together all of the different needs to have a well-diversified program? So all of these different pieces shape sort of the glide path and considerations. I mentioned earlier that I was part of our quantitative group, and they've put together this analysis, and these are the key factors that we think about in terms of constructing alternatives programs. And the darker the circle means that they are more attractive from a target date fund standpoint. At the top, we have an evergreen fund, and here you can see that return potential over both the short term and the long term is very attractive because these are mature assets that consistently generate performance. Primary funds, as I mentioned before, take a while to develop that return pattern. We think that J curve can be mitigated with evergreen funds, and then a well-designed primary program, if you select well, if it's built perfectly, can probably deliver a little bit better return over the long term. And then you have liquidity management, which is the bane of anybody's existence who has to really manage these programs. The level of unfunded commitments you can see here, much more attractive in the use of evergreens. Cash flow, predictability, also the ability to redeem out of these funds. And then from a horizon standpoint, the ability to really meet the needs of whatever investment horizon you have, whereas primary funds are destined are typically 12 to 15 years in terms of that duration and horizon. And so if you bring all of these together and you think about the role of evergreen funds in the context of the journey of a target date program, there are kind of four key roles that I'd like to point to. Number one is in the early going, where you want to maximize the amount of alternatives exposure to those who are earlier in the career, this ability to ramp the exposure in that earlier phase and build that. Next, this ability throughout the glide path to create more flexibility with your alternatives program to complement those traditional drawdown vehicles. Also, this ability to, because you have this volatile public markets, the ability to then manage to different targets and to rebalance. And then lastly, to be able to retain exposure even through the late career and retirement phase of a target date, because you have this flexible exposure to highly diversified assets. It can be really valuable in terms of driving performance. And to wrap up, this is just kind of bringing all these pieces together. The use of evergreens in the context of target date funds, number one, you have this alignment from a liquidity standpoint throughout the entire glide path. You have this ability in a single allocation to create diversification across different vintages and strategies and GPs. These funds tend to have between 100 and 1,000 different underlying company exposures. We talked a bit about the simplified capital management, no unfunded obligations. Reducing the burden on those that have to run these programs so that they can focus on making decisions elsewhere in terms of targeted exposures. And then the last one, and this is a really important one from a regulatory standpoint, one of the key pieces of the reforms is this need to be able to transfer assets easily. Evergreen funds are much easier to transfer over to another plan as necessary, unlike traditional assets that are much more cumbersome. And then also the transparency, the regular valuations, the returns, the ability to stay within regulatory targets and ranges. And so with that, I really want to thank you for your time, and hopefully you have found this helpful in terms of the role of private markets, what's going on with evergreens, and their unique ability to really shape outcomes for the affiliates over time in a target date context. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Drew. Muchísimas gracias. Y gracias por ajustarse al tiempo, exactos 20 minutos. Seguimos a continuación con la charla de inversión inmobiliaria en Estados Unidos a cargo de Stephen Evans, Managing Director de Black Salmon. Lo vamos a recibir con un aplauso.
Believe me, I'll do it in 20 minutes.
We're the one to go backwards.
Green? Okay. Buenas tardes. That's the best I can do in Spanish. I can make my way to a bathroom or I can get a cold beer, but that's all the Spanish I have. I apologize. Hello, my name is Stephen Evans. I'm with Black Salmon Capital. I'm managing director. Black Salmon is a Miami-based developer and investment manager in the real estate asset class. We primarily focus on housing and industrial. We also have done investments across other property types. But the reason why we like industrial in the multifamily sector is the fact that there's great fundamentals in the medium and long term. My personal experience within the real estate market has been nearly 40 years. You can probably tell I pulled all my hair out. But I really do love those two property sectors. And I've had the ability to work with a lot of pension funds in my career, talking about real estate specifically and in the investment real estate world specifically. So I want to talk about industrial today. Oh, shoot. I didn't even have my pretty face on the screen, so you couldn't see me. So in the industrial market, I wanted to kind of give a very high-level overview about what the industrial market is and maybe give you a little bit more education about real estate industrial. We've talked about this earlier today. One of our competitors in the market talked about how they like the industrial property sector, and I want to get a little bit more granular about that and maybe educate you a little bit about the real estate market in the United States. So you can't talk about industrial without talking about the supply chain. I know it's an overused term, but supply chain really means, how do I get my goods from end to end, from when it's arrived in the U.S. or manufactured in the U.S. and delivered to its final destination, whether or not it's a person at their home or a business. And so at Black Salmon Capital, we think there's an opportunity to invest across the entire supply chain. So the illustration that I put on the screen is showing the different types of industrial properties that you can invest in. I also want to talk about industrial infrastructure, is basically the line between those boxes that I have on the screen. So at the top of the illustration, I'm showing cold storage. And in the United States, a lot of cold storage in the past was really mom and pop or family-owned cold storage. And that has really been changed now with more corporate users needing more modern, efficient properties that have higher quality refrigeration systems and the ability to look at a much larger footprint for cold storage users. I believe that's a great place to invest in the real estate market today because it's in its infancy. On the dry storage side, which is on the bottom of the page, really think about it this way, that whether or not a product is being manufactured in the U.S., or even Mexico for that matter, or arriving from another country, it's either coming from boat, by air, by train, or by truck. And from that point, it needs to flow through the entire supply chain to get to its ultimate customer. So at the far left of the graphic at the bottom, I'm actually showing the large distribution centers. These are products like Amazon or Target or Walmart. These are properties that are 800,000 square feet to 2 million square feet. These are giant, enormous properties. We call them bombers in the industry. And these properties are located outside of city centers in areas where the land is much cheaper and you have much easier way to distribute your product. If you move from the left to the right, we're talking about smaller properties that are getting closer and closer to those population centers. So they also may be large properties that are what we call cross-docked properties for distribution, but there may be more than one of those properties across the United States for distribution. You get to the far right of that graphic, I'm showing the last mile, last touch types facilities. These are properties that are much smaller. They're much more closer to the population center. And the whole idea of the supply chain is to move product efficiently, cost-effectively, and as quickly as possible. And in the U.S., my wife is using the internet all the time and shopping all the time, and she wants to get her product as quickly as possible. And retailers are trying to hone a model to make that happen. And so getting service within a couple days or one-day delivery, and now we're talking about same-day delivery for product. That's why the supply chain is so important for the movement of goods, and its early emphasis, early part of its structure at this moment in time. But the line that I'm showing between the boxes are really talking about industrial infrastructure. And so what is that? So to have the movement of goods efficiently and cost-effectively and timely, you also have things like modes of transportation, as in the truck or train. And these are properties such as truck terminals, such as vehicle maintenance facilities, things like outdoor storage for trucks, trailers, and containers, and things like transload facilities, which are necessary near port markets for the movement of goods. All those containers that come off the big ships have to be emptied and then put on trucks for their next delivery or their final delivery. And those type of properties are very important for the movement of goods. So you can't also talk about industrial without talking about the population. So where the population goes, that's where industrial goes. And I show on this map that of the 341 million people in the United States, 70% are on the east side of the country. And so, although the most populated state within the United States is actually California, most of the population is on the eastern side of the country. So I kind of looked this up before making this talk, that in Santiago, you all have about 6 million people. To put things in scale or perspective, in the United States, there are 6 metropolitan areas that have 6 million people or more. Of those 6, 5 are on the East Coast, only 1 is on the West Coast. The other thing I want to point out is in the United States, and this happened prior to COVID, but more exacerbated by COVID, is the movement of people within the United States to other parts of the United States. And so people on the West Coast and in the Midwest and the Northeast have actually been migrating to the South. And that's an important factor when it comes to industrial. So now let's kind of look at why is this thing not moving on me? There we go. If you look at an overlay of where the industrial distribution markets are in relation to the population, I think this graphic shows it very well. There are 4 primary distribution markets in the United States. That's the LA market, Chicago, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Atlanta. And these are key to know because these are the places where we like to invest and where we see the most upside opportunity because where that demand is. Now, as far as the distribution of the product, obviously I talked about air and talked about ship, truck, and train. If you see on this graphic as well, you'll notice that most of that network is on the eastern side of the country, and obviously because it's meeting the population needs of the U.S. But not noted on this map, I think is important to note. The number 1 and largest port in the United States is actually in L.A., L.A. Long Beach. And that product that's coming into that market is measured by what we call TEUs, which is the 20-foot equivalent unit, otherwise known as a container. And the container volume coming into the West Coast is roughly 20 million containers are coming in annually as of the 2024. But the other 2 largest ports, or the second and third largest ports, are actually on the east coast of the United States, second being New York, New Jersey. Now, that's a very big population center, and a lot of that product is actually staying there and is not being distributed, at least not in too far of a region. But the third largest port in the United States, surprisingly enough, is not a big population center. It's actually Savannah, Georgia, which you probably never heard of if you're from Santiago or from LATAM. The Savannah market is a very small populated market, but the number 3 largest port and a very important port. And why is that? One, obviously, is close to the population center on the east side of the country and in the south, but the state of Georgia had invested billions of dollars into expanding the port, putting more money in the infrastructure, and widening and deepening the port in order to take on larger ships that are coming in from, say, Asia that can now pass through the Panama Canal. And now these larger ships have access to the United States from the East Coast. What's important from an investor point of view is the ports can only invest in their ports. They require the developers and investors to actually put product on the ground because they only can grow as much as the product on the ground near it in order to support that growth. So those are the other kind of markets that we like too, those areas to which that are growing and that there's reasons to actually make investments in those particular markets. The other thing not mentioned on this map is where are the air cargo hubs within the United States. And surprisingly, it is a small market in the South, in Memphis, Tennessee, and that's the hub of Federal Express, obviously a global air cargo delivery system. The second largest in continental United States is actually Louisville, Kentucky, also a smaller population market, but that's where United Parcel Service, or UPS, actually has their major air hub. The third largest is actually in my backyard. We're from Miami, is actually in Miami. And clearly that's a market that has a lot of connectivity to LATAM as well as the Caribbean and in Europe. But surprisingly to note, in a very fast mover in the air cargo business is Amazon, who are actually investing millions, if not billions of dollars on actually creating their own air cargo hub, of all places, Cincinnati market, Ohio. So I think my point is driving home here that a lot of those markets I just mentioned to you is actually on the east side of the country, again, following that population. So let's talk about the greater market of industrial in the U.S. So according to Cushman & Wakefield's second quarter report, the market is probably about 7.1, 7.2% vacant. And I can argue to you that that is a very healthy market. What's really interesting is the market really surged post-COVID, had a record amount of volume for new supply coming to the market. In fact, since 2021, there's been approximately 2.3 billion square feet put on the ground, and still we're only at a 7.1% vacancy. At the same time, there was a record amount of absorption. So you have a lot of new product coming in, but all that new product is now being leased. And I'll talk about that in a moment on why that's occurring. So where we are in the market now that has been normalized is we're seeing that there's been a great reduction in the supply coming to market. We're actually 73% off peak and the lowest level of new supply in 12 years. So fundamentally on the supply side, it's very strong and fundamentally sound. The other thing I want to mention here on this chart here, the chart on the right, is you'll see the blue line that looks like a roller coaster. And what that's showing is rent growth, not rent dropping. The rent growth is at a lower level than where it was several years ago. So you go back to 2021, where the rents were year over year increasing by 20% per year, which is unsustainable. And now that the market's normalized, it's more in the 2 to 4%. But you couple the lack of new supply coming in the market, and I'm going to now talk about the demand, you can see that there's very good runway and good fundamentals in the industrial property sector. I want to note one more fact there is that if you were buying real estate, industrial real estate specifically, and there's embedded rent growth within those portfolios, because if you're marking to market and you've had rent increases from 20 to 15% over the last few years, you have a natural opportunity to mark those new leases to market, either new tenants coming in or existing renewals. So we think it's a historical mark within the real estate space in order to react on that. So on the demand side, there's three fundamental principles that we're following. One is e-commerce. We've already talked about it, and everybody knows much about it. But if it's growing at 10% per year, that's tremendous in the case of the United States. You add to the fact that it has a great penetration within the retail market as well. It's projected that in 2027, it'll have 30% penetration in the core retail sales. Basically, that's brick and mortar. So we believe that fundamentally we're going to see more and more surge in the e-commerce side of the house, and that now we're seeing that industrial property almost act like retail property from that perspective. Also the story of a reshoring and nearshoring. I'm going to stop for a moment and talk maybe a little bit about tariffs, because I know a lot of people have been maybe a little bit concerned about that. Whether you like him or you don't like him, Donald Trump just has his way, and he's bombastic in his statements, and he tries to make huge market-moving headline discussion on the way he negotiates. And in my view is the U.S. economy is like a battleship, very hard to stop. It continues to push forward. And so ultimately, Donald Trump is trying to have tariffs for the purposes of growing the coffers for the U.S. market. But I just think it's a temporary issue that's going to sort its way out in due time. But ultimately, using these tariffs for putting more manufacturing on U.S. soil is, I think, a big part of that. And that's a bipartisan issue, whether or not it's Donald Trump or even the prior administration with Biden. Both are trying to put more jobs and putting more manufacturing jobs into the United States. As a result, that, in fact, is a demand driver for warehouse. I'll mention one other matter is I said about the supply chain of being efficient and cost-effective and as quickly as possible. By having manufacturing on U.S. soil, that actually shortens the supply chain, which more, in fact, emboldens the reason to have manufacturing on U.S. soil. The last one I will mention is the flight to quality. And I mentioned that that large amount of supply to hit the market, 2.1 billion square feet coming into the marketplace, that was all absorbed. And the reason for that is that the product within the U.S. is very old. In fact, on average, it's about 40 years old. And 30% of that is over 50 years old. So the product is very old and antiquated, and users are demanding a better, efficient, better designed, modern facilities in order to make it more efficient and more cost-effective. These are higher volumes for storage of goods, better circulation, better lighting and fire suppression system. All that goes into more demand for new product as that supply chain has continued to be built out. And I, for one, believe that these three demand drivers are not for the short term, they're actually for the long term, given the sentiment I just mentioned. So how do we deal with the market? What's our approach? And candidly, real estate is fairly simple. Maybe hard to execute, but it's a pretty simple premise, and that it's local. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in the business for nearly 40 years. I have a lot of contacts in the market and have been doing this for a very long time and have strong conviction for the industrial space. And given the fact that it's local, you need to know the people. You need to know where the product is. You need to know where to be investing. You need to know the people. That's what makes the market run, is the people that within the real estate business. And so having connectivity and having a brand that's known in the United States and local, ultimately, we think that's a differentiator for us. Second is market selection. And I think that is a very key aspect of our ability to either perform or not, in that where you, in fact, decide to invest. I gave a big overview of some of the markets that we like and some of the reasons why we like it, but it's not just the market. It's where you want to be in that market, and where in that sub-market do you want to be, and where on that corner or where in that distribution market that you want to be that you can think that you could be most successful. So blending those two things of being local and market selection is, in fact, how do you underwrite? And we have to take a very long, arduous process within our underwriting. We take a lot of rigor, a lot of honest discussion in investment committee on how we want this investment to react in a particular market. What is the basis at acquisition or at development, and where are you going to be selling at? What rents are going to be? What cap rates are going to be? And all the other attributes of that particular investment. And I think you need to have that local market knowledge and being able to be very selective of where you actually want to invest. I think it's more about where not to invest and actually even where to invest, and not to be able to make mistakes. So our number one goal is capital preservation. And with that in mind, that's how we invest. So lastly, and first, most importantly, I'm not the one keeping you from lunch. is with Black Salmon Capital, we believe that we have a very unique investment thesis with regards to the industrial property type, because we look at it holistically. We look at it from end to end, from where that product comes on to market and as it flows through the supply chain and ultimately to its final destination. And whether or not it's in a distribution warehouse that's a very large exterior type location to an interior location as in the last mile, which we have done, or across the industrial infrastructure, which we have invested in, as well as the cold storage, we think that we have a unique value proposition in the industrial property type. And I look forward to an opportunity to answer any questions or meet you when you're available today. Thank you. Let's see if I can do this without killing myself.
Thank you so much, Steven. Y gracias por la presentación y por también ajustarse al tiempo, porque ahora vamos a hacer un panel reducido para poder alcanzar y almorzar y volver al bloque de la tarde. Y para ello, entonces, continuamos con el panel de conversación sobre activos alternativos, sus oportunidades y desafíos. Y para ello recibimos en este escenario a Francisco Mina, gerente de renta variable e indirecta AFP Habitat de Chile, a Julio Florian, Head Regional de Inversiones Sur Asset Management, y a Mateo Fernández, gerente de inversiones AFAP Itaú Uruguay. Modera este panel Jaime de la Barra, socio, director y Global Head of IP&S de Vinci Compass. Adelante, ustedes tienen la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias a FIAP y a nuestros distinguidos panelistas por participar en esta interesante discusión que, como hemos escuchado esta mañana, es un mercado en crecimiento y que ha ido complementando los mercados públicos y que ofrece muchas ventajas, pero también presenta desafíos. Y eso es de lo que vamos a conversar hoy en este panel. Partiendo por Julio, Sura está presente en prácticamente todos los mercados de pensiones en América Latina. ¿Cómo contrasta la inversión en activos alternativos entre los países donde ustedes tienen presencia y que a ti te toca actuar?
Gracias, Jaime. Bueno, en primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Es un gusto estar en el panel con todos ustedes y contigo, Jaime. En segundo lugar, aclarar que Sura Asset Management es accionista mayoritario de 5 administradoras de fondos de pensiones a lo largo de la región, específicamente en Uruguay, Chile, Colombia, Perú y en México. Y desde mi rol regional he tenido el privilegio de ver la evolución de las carteras de instrumentos alternativos a lo largo de todos estos negocios. Te diría que hay 4 factores que podría compartir que definen esas diferencias, las más resaltantes en todo caso. El primero sería la madurez de la cartera. Ciertamente para aquellos portafolios que son más consolidados o más maduros, la composición de esta cartera va a ser distinta de lo que es la composición de una cartera más joven o de una cartera en un punto medio, ¿no? Te diría que el segundo factor sería el componente de mercados públicos. Si tomamos en cuenta un Total Portfolio Approach que busca ver la cartera como un todo, no necesariamente como silos, el componente de mercado público dentro de las carteras es el componente más grande y indefectiblemente afecta la exposición de factores a lo largo de toda la cartera. Y esto indudablemente va a terminar afectando la composición particular de cada negocio en los mercados privados. El tercer componente sería, o el tercer factor, digamos, sería los benchmarks locales. Recordemos pues que cada uno de estos negocios tiene benchmarks locales y eso indudablemente impacta tanto en la composición de la allocation, así como en algunos casos en el selection de algunos gestores. Y finalmente, no por ser menos importante, obviamente el tema regulatorio, que por supuesto que afecta tanto los componentes de allocation como particularmente también los componentes de selección de managers dentro de los fondos. Para redondear, digamos, igual, sí creemos pues, que más allá de estas diferencias que se producen por estos factores, las carteras pues, están altamente diversificadas alrededor de los distintos subasset clases, distintas geografías y distintas estrategias también.
Muchas gracias, Julio. Una pregunta para Mateo, que Mateo es el gerente de inversiones de AFAP Itaú. El mercado uruguayo tiene ciertas particularidades en las cuales tu experiencia y de las AFAPs en general ha estado más orientada al mercado local. ¿Cómo ha sido esa experiencia de invertir en alternativos en el mercado local y con qué desafíos se han encontrado?
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Jaime, y a la gente de la FIAP por permitirnos participar. Primero, capaz poner un poquito de contexto de qué es lo que nos lleva a ese fuerte foco en lo local. Nosotros recién en 2013 fuimos a un esquema de bifondos y recién en 2023 un esquema de multifondos tratando de, obviamente, la regulación, aumentar un poco la exposición a activos más riesgosos para afiliados más jóvenes. Adicionalmente tenemos una regulación que es muy restrictiva respecto a lo que hace al menú de inversiones, restringiendo mucho lo que es invertir en el exterior de Uruguay. Nosotros podemos invertir solo hasta un 15% del portafolio en activos extranjeros y muy limitado, pero es bastante laxa esa regulación en lo que es a inversión en activos locales. Entre esos activos fideicomisos nosotros podríamos, en teoría, llevar casi el 50% de los activos bajo manejo a fideicomisos que invierten en la economía real. Entonces, en ese proceso de buscar diversificar los portafolios y de buscar salir un poco de renta fija, que era donde estaba hace 10 años, quizás el 75% del portafolio, fuimos hacia inversión en activos locales, activos reales locales a través de fideicomisos que, si bien están listados en bolsas, tienen características más parecidas a activos privados que activos de oferta pública. Claramente en ese proceso hemos tenido varios desafíos. Diría que los principales están asociados a la falta de liquidez de estos instrumentos. Falta de liquidez que viene por dos lados. Primero, el tipo de activos, que son activos que requieren una maduración larga. Estoy hablando de activos forestales, infraestructura, real estate. Requieren maduración larga del activo subyacente. Y segundo, porque dadas las características del mercado uruguayo, prácticamente, dadas las características del mercado uruguayo, solo invertimos las AFAP en estos vehículos. O sea, y las AFAP somos 4 en Uruguay. O sea, son activos que, si bien son listados, tienen 4 inversores. Entonces, lo que es la transacción en el mercado de esos activos es prácticamente inexistente. Entonces, esa liquidez trae desafíos asociados primero a la falta de una evaluación a mercado de estos activos, y obviamente la falta de evaluación a mercado trae dos desafíos que son, primero, las posibles transferencias de valor entre afiliados de distintas generaciones. Obviamente yo tengo valuado un activo que no lo tengo valuado a mercado y hay una jubilación. Quien queda en el fondo se lleva el beneficio de un activo que todavía no recogió esas ganancias, y obviamente otros desafíos más asociados a la liquidez en sí, pero que no han sido tanto un problema hasta ahora porque no hemos tenido restricciones de liquidez. Entonces, eso es un poco los principales desafíos asociados a la liquidez. Capaz yendo un poco de atrás, ¿por qué no hacemos más equity o acciones en Uruguay? Directamente no hay acciones locales, hay solo 4 empresas listadas en bolsa en Uruguay. Eso ha sido ha hecho bastante compleja esa diversificación, por eso fuimos por este otro camino.
Muchas gracias, Mateo. Francisco, ya prácticamente una década y media en que los fondos de pensiones chilenos empezaron a invertir en activos alternativos globales. Aparte de la liquidez, en esta experiencia larga, ¿qué otros desafíos les ha tocado enfrentar en este proceso?
Bueno, la liquidez fue un desafío ahí por el año 17-20, donde la AFP enfrentamos dos tormentas. Los retiros, que significaron aproximadamente un 25% de los AUM, pero también teníamos cambios masivos entre los multifondos, que en el caso de Habitat llegaron a representar casi el 30% de los AUM en un mes. Nosotros suponemos que ese escenario está descartado, no lo vamos a volver a enfrentar. Por lo tanto, la liquidez, más que ser un desafío, es algo que es buscado. La falta de liquidez de estos activos hace que uno vaya a buscar premios que están disponibles para aquellos inversionistas como nosotros que no la necesitamos. Por lo tanto, los desafíos tienen más que ver con otro tipo de cosas. Primero, con el acceso. Como son mercados privados, podríamos definirlos como un club de amigos en donde los mejores negocios están para los mejores amigos. Y uno tendría que centrarse ahí para tener mejor acceso a esos negocios. Obviamente, cuando uno es Habitat y tiene un portfolio grande, parece ser buen amigo. Pero esa relación hay que cultivarla y se cultivan a través de los años. Y por eso nosotros hemos invertido tiempo, ganas, dólares, todo lo que significa invertir, en construir un equipo que esté presente idealmente en los mejores centros financieros mundiales como para tener acceso a estos negocios. Otro desafío que yo creo que se va a venir tiene que ver con los exits. Si bien todos nosotros entendemos que estas son inversiones de largo plazo, 10, 15, 20 años, en algún momento se acaban. Y nuestra cartera se está acercando a ese momento. Y cómo afrontar y cómo reenganchar ese dinero invertido también es un desafío más o menos grande. En lo local, otro desafío que podríamos comentar es que previo a la reforma, donde era muy difícil invertir de forma directa, las AFP en general no teníamos acceso alguno a ser un player importante de activos alternativos locales. Y desde esa época ahora hemos tratado de transformarnos en un jugador importante. En estos 7 años, desde la reforma del 2017, hemos hecho algo así como 7 deals directos. Nuestra definición para deal directo significa o que fueron propietarios porque se generaron dentro de nuestro network o porque se invirtió directamente en un activo y no a través de un fondo. Y hemos salido 2 de esos activos. Por lo tanto, esa generación de conocimiento interno es algo que queremos seguir explorando hacia el futuro.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. En la misma línea, Julio, ¿cuál ha sido la experiencia tuya de invertir en activos alternativos locales en la región?
Como supondrás, depende de cada localidad, ¿no? Dicho eso, en neto ha sido una experiencia mucho más retadora los mercados locales en general versus el equivalente mercado internacional. Te describiría 3 retos particulares que se me ocurre que podrían explicar esa dificultad. En primer lugar, sería la profundidad de mercado. Nosotros, como asset allocators, construimos portafolios. Si bien en mercados alternativos o en mercados privados no se busca necesariamente tener todo el mercado, o sea, no se busca tener el beta de mercado, sí partes de tener, como cualquier gestor de portafolios, un set de oportunidades o un funnel lo suficientemente robusto como para poder armar una cartera. En mercados locales, por el lado de la allocation, hay muchos sub-asset classes dentro de mercados privados que no tienen alta representatividad. Y dentro del selection, para aquellos sub-asset classes que sí tienen representatividad dentro de los mercados, hay muy poca cantidad de gestores dentro de los cuales elegir. Incluso un asset class donde ha habido representatividad histórica en nuestros países a nivel local, que es real estate, hay un número, digamos, bajo o chico de gestores entre los cuales hacer el selection, por ejemplo. Ese es el primer reto. El segundo reto sería alrededor de... perdón, unas notas acá, discúlpeme. Las diferencias en las evaluaciones y en los estándares que implementamos los LPs versus los GPs locales. Si bien tanto los LPs como los GPs hemos crecido juntos en esta industria, que hoy continúa siendo muy joven comparado a los mercados internacionales, ese roce que han tenido los LPs con los mercados internacionales conlleva a una diferenciación de estándares que los LPs han traído a los mercados locales y que sentimos que los GPs locales no necesariamente han incorporado o aún no han incorporado dentro de su oferta de valor. Y esto particularmente aterriza en o dilatan los procesos de, por un lado, fundraising, porque la debida diligencia se hace un poco más cuesta arriba, y por otro lado también dilatan el proceso de monitoreo, porque muchas veces los equipos de inversiones o del proceso de inversión están más, si quieren, ocupados atendiendo temas más administrativos de los fondos que ocupándose de la gestión de las carteras per se. El tercer reto, y en contraste con el mercado internacional, lo que hemos visto es una potenciación de varios temas que se están viendo a nivel internacional dentro de los mercados locales. Dígase, por ejemplo, la falta de distribuciones, a lo que aludieron antes, por ejemplo, bueno, y varios de los paneles. La falta de distribuciones, diferenciación o cambios en las estrategias de inversión o lo que se conoce como style drifting, la aparición de conflictos de interés que no necesariamente son mitigados de manera adecuada o manejados de manera adecuada, entre otros ejemplos. Ojo que son temas que sí ocurren en los mercados internacionales, pero nos parece que se potencian en los mercados locales, por ejemplo. Todo lo que mencionaba anteriormente conlleva o aterriza en una dinámica de riesgo-retorno más complicada para los mercados locales versus lo que serían los mercados internacionales hacia adelante.
Interesante tu comentario que para sobrellevar esos riesgos y esas dificultades, lo natural sería que cualquier inversionista buscara retornos un poco más altos. Y eso yo creo que es un desafío para las políticas públicas, de cómo igualar, por decirlo así, las exigencias de retorno en los mercados locales para que ese ahorro se canalice en forma correcta a las inversiones locales. Muy interesante tu comentario. Mateo, en el caso del sistema en Uruguay ya tiene 25.000 millones de dólares, un sistema grande, y en general, cuando uno ve la literatura académica, en la práctica, la diversificación internacional es algo deseado y que en Uruguay todavía no es una realidad. ¿Cómo ves tú los prospectos o el futuro del sistema uruguayo respecto a la potencial diversificación internacional de esas carteras?
Totalmente. Voy a citar una frase que dijo nuestro presidente en una reunión con inversores argentinos. Dijo que los uruguayos somos como los argentinos, pero más lentos. Esa fue creo que podemos conversar sobre la frase, pero es verdad que somos un poco lentos para hacer algunos cambios. Nuestra visión obviamente es que es hora de aumentar el menú de activos disponibles. Dentro de ese menú, obviamente renta variable internacional es la prioridad número 1, pero también entrarían, entendemos, en etapas posteriores lo que es alternativos internacionales. Esta visión no es solo nuestra, o sea, no es solo FAP y Tabú, obviamente hay consenso en la industria, diría que a nivel de analistas y también a nivel de regulador. Lo que ha sido el desafío es que se necesitan cambios en leyes para esto, legislativos. Y bueno, la dificultad ahí ha estado en conseguir los consensos políticos necesarios para que esto se lleve a cabo. Nosotros somos optimistas, creemos que esto más tarde o más temprano va a ocurrir, pero bueno, nos gustaría que sea antes para beneficio de los afiliados, porque acá obviamente los que tienen para ganar con cambios en ese sentido son los afiliados con mejores jubilaciones.
Muchas gracias, Mateo. A Francisco, en beneficio del tiempo, voy a unir dos preguntas en una. Y esto en relación a la reforma de pensiones en Chile. Uno de los principales cambios que se introduce es el cambio desde multifondos, de multiactivo, a fondos generacionales. Entonces, la primera pregunta es ¿qué rol ves y qué desafíos también ves para los activos alternativos de esta nueva estructura de fondos generacionales? Y la segunda pregunta es el elefante en la cristalería, es cómo afecta la licitación del 10% del stock a los fondos de pensiones.
Ya, nosotros vemos tres desafíos fundamentales. El primero y más obvio es cómo colocamos a los activos alternativos dentro de los futuros fondos generacionales. Y nosotros creemos que hay espacio para que haya más. ¿Cuánto más? Bastante más. ¿Y por qué? Porque la misma duración de maduración de los activos alternativos hace que calce de mejor forma esas inversiones en unos fondos que están diseñados para durar 20, 30, 40 años, tal vez más, si uno piensa en los cortes más jóvenes. ¿Ya? Pero dentro de ese desafío de cómo los ponemos y cuánto ponemos, también hay que pensar de que no todos los activos alternativos son private equity. Y tradicionalmente dentro de la experiencia local ha estado muy enfocado al private equity. Y probablemente en los fondos generacionales de personas mayores es probable que la necesidad de tener private equity no sea igual que de los fondos más jóvenes. Por lo tanto, también va a haber que desarrollar un músculo nuevo de invertir en cosas alternativas, pero que son más estabilizadas, menos riesgosas, probablemente con contratos de largo plazo, estoy pensando en concesiones, cosas así. Segundo desafío importante y que hay que salir jugando bien, porque si los regímenes y los benchmarks quedan mal construidos, probablemente el resultado no va a ser del todo deseado. El segundo desafío tiene que ver con el tema de las licitaciones. Y nosotros creemos que las dificultades de traspasar activos alternativos superan con creces los beneficios de traspasarlos. ¿Qué dificultades hay? Bueno, es costoso. De acuerdo a algunos estudios, cada contrato a traspasar puede costar entre unos pocos miles hasta unos varios miles de dólares. Y pensando que en el sistema local hay más de 200 fondos, no sé cuántos contratos hay, el estar traspasando contratos cada 2 años puede ser un esquema bastante caro y no se sabe quién lo va a pagar. En segundo lugar, también creemos que van a haber algunos gestores que no les guste este esquema y decidan retirarse del mercado local. Por lo tanto, el universo invertible va a ser más chico y probablemente de una calidad algo inferior. Pero en tercer lugar, nosotros creemos que es bastante fundamental y es que desarrollar un equipo especialista que invierta en estos tipos de activos cuesta y es un factor importante para la diferenciación entre las distintas AFP. Por lo tanto, pueden haber AFP que quieran invertir más, otras AFP que quieran invertir menos, y la norma y la regulación creemos que debería un poquito impulsar esa competencia sana. Cuando uno compite en buena lid, en general los resultados son bastante mejores. Y que cada 2 años el fruto de ese esfuerzo, de ese trabajo, se vaya, hace que haya menos incentivos para desarrollar ese músculo internamente. Creemos que ese factor O sea, definitivamente es malo, difícil cuantificarlo, pero bastante negativo. Entonces, nosotros proponemos que no haya traspaso de la cartera de alternativos derechamente, porque creemos que tanto la AFP que manda o la que recibe, perfectamente puede ser manejable recibir caja en vez de esas posiciones. Hemos visto en la presentación anterior que ya existen productos bastante líquidos para tener exposición rápida a activos alternativos que pueden ayudar un poquito a solventar este problema. Pero en tercer lugar también hay un desafío que se ha hablado poco y que tiene que ver con el esquema de benchmark y de premio y castigos que tiene la nueva norma. En teoría, en algunos meses más, vamos a empezar a invertir contra un benchmark y nos van a premiar o nos van a castigar si es que le ganamos o perdemos contra ese benchmark. Y medir la cartera de alternativos es un desafío que es no menor y se ha hablado muy poco todavía. Y ahí nosotros no tenemos todavía algo que decir, básicamente, porque creemos que es el problema más grande y más difícil de solucionar. ¿Ya? Porque no todas las AFPs tenemos la misma madurez en los programas. Si se define un benchmark, quizás para una AFP sea más fácil lograrlo que lo otro, por un tema de diversificación de vintage. Es un tema bien grande que no vemos solución todavía y hay que estudiarlo más.
Gracias, Francisco. Julio, en abril de este año se produce el famoso proceso de Liberation Day y eso gatilla una serie de consecuencias de mercado en que hay menos transacciones de compra y venta de empresas, hay menos aperturas a bolsa y eso trajo consigo una disminución en las distribuciones y al mismo tiempo se ha producido una suerte de euforia en los mercados líquidos, sobre todo asociados al fenómeno de la inteligencia artificial. ¿Cómo ha afectado este fenómeno la inversión en alternativos, que es una inversión más de largo plazo, pero que obviamente se tiene que adaptar a las condiciones de corto plazo de los mercados?
Claro que sí. Esta dinámica, digamos, de estas caídas abruptas en mercados públicos, con un asset class como mercados privados, donde no hay distribuciones, no hay devolución, y donde hay un lag en las valorizaciones por construcción del mercado tal como es, podría llevar a este fenómeno que se llama el efecto denominador, ¿no? Entonces, el efecto denominador implica que crece la proporción de activos alternativos dentro de la cartera de manera pasiva y esto en neto lo que termina ocurriendo es una menor capacidad para gestionar alternativos en las carteras. Yo te diría que digamos, producto de esta falta de liquidez en el mercado y algunos rezagos de efecto denominador que se siguen viendo, ha habido cierto accionar de parte tanto de GPs como LPs. Por el lado de los GPs, explorando pues mayores dinámicas de liquidez, como continuation vehicles, por ejemplo, que seguramente muchos han escuchado de. Y por el lado de los LPs hay mucha exploración por el lado de transacciones secundarias, que son muy comunes pues, en mercados desarrollados, poco menos acá en Latinoamérica, pero en mercados desarrollados, como decía, son muy comunes como una herramienta activa de gestión de portafolio. Hoy y hacia adelante, este contexto o este fenómeno, o la aparición de este fenómeno, o los rezagos de este fenómeno definitivamente deberían afectar tanto el allocation como el selection de las carteras de alternativos. Por el lado de la allocation, como mencionábamos antes, se infla o crece, digamos, de manera pasiva la exposición a alternativos y eso hace que sea en muchos países mucho más tangible los límites regulatorios, con lo cual hace mucho más complicado poder invertir o comprometer capital de una manera anual como es propio o típico de una cartera para evitar tener este riesgo de vintage, que es invirtamos en todos los vintages para no correr riesgo de no tener un vintage en la cartera. Eso por el lado de allocation. Por el lado de selection, yo vería el vaso medio lleno en términos de que esta dinámica de menores distribuciones se incorpore dentro de los modelos, por ejemplo, de selección de gestores, ¿no? Estamos hablando de una industria, una clase de activo que tiene pocos data points. Entonces, poder añadir data points distintos dentro de un ciclo distinto de comportamiento de flujo debería, en el margen, mejorar estos modelos de screening. Ahora, en la TAM, aludiendo al punto sobre qué puede suceder también en las carteras, en el margen, en la TAM, creo que tenemos ciertos factores que ayudan como un contrapeso a lo que podría ser un efecto denominador o al rezado del efecto denominador. En general, comparado a mercados desarrollados, tenemos un factor demográfico más positivo, con una pirámide más amplia en la base y con mayores contribuciones y, por ende, pues, menos necesidad de otorgar pensión todavía. Y eso en el margen, comparado con países desarrollados, debería diluir más el efecto de estos componentes más ilíquidos en las carteras. Y adicionalmente, creería que, aludiendo al punto anterior sobre cómo los modelos mejoran, nuevamente, estos nuevos puntos de data en un ciclo distinto de comportamiento de flujo debería mejorar tanto los modelos de allocation como los modelos de selection de las AFPs, digamos, dejándonos o posibilitándonos el hecho de armar carteras más robustas hacia adelante que incorporen este tipo de escenarios de comportamiento de flujos, ¿no?
Nos estamos quedando sin tiempo, pero no quería dejar de hacerles una pregunta a cada uno en 30 segundos. ¿Cuáles creen que son los principales o el principal desafío y la principal oportunidad para ustedes como inversionistas en los próximos 12 a 24 meses?
Bueno, yo creo que el principal desafío es cómo participamos de la revolución tecnológica que estamos viendo. Infraestructura, data center, pero también las compañías de software del futuro. Probablemente el mundo que vean mis hijos va a ser muy distinto al nuestro. Y ahí está, yo creo, las mayores oportunidades.
Gracias. Mateo.
Bueno, relacionado a los alternativos específicamente, veo que el principal desafío del lado nuestro es trabajar sobre las valuaciones para que las valuaciones reflejen en mejor medida el valor de los activos subyacentes que hay en este tipo de vehículos.
Por lado de las oportunidades, creo que Drew Snow lo mostró en uno de los cuadros, o sea, el allocation que hay alternativos hoy, cómo se ha incrementado. Hablando desde nuestro view, por supuesto, es importante que continúe la allocation a esta clase de activo por la mejora que le hace o cómo potencia el riesgo-retorno de las carteras en general, lo cual llevaría, pues, a mayores tasas de reemplazo y mayores pensiones para los afiliados. Creería que el reto está, y lo mencioné por partes dentro de las intervenciones, en afinar más esos modelos de GP Selection. O sea, tenemos en un contexto donde hay mucha más competencia por los activos subyacentes en los mercados privados y en un contexto donde hay, digamos, si bien podrían bajar las tasas, evidentemente estamos en un contexto ya de normalización de tasas donde ya no están, pues, en el piso como estuvieron, pues, los últimos, digamos, post-GFC, ¿no? Por ahí lo vería yo.
Muchas gracias a los tres por sus interesantes perspectivas y ahora ya es la hora del almuerzo, así que estamos listos.
Muchísimas gracias a Francisco, Julio, Mateo y a Jaime por esta conversación. Así es momento de almorzar. Está servido ya el almuerzo en el Salón Atacama, que es saliendo a mano derecha. Y después damos una vuelta y ahí ustedes van a ver el Salón Atacama. Es un almuerzo que es ofrecido por la Raín Vial y en su director de inversiones, José Manuel Silva, entregará un contexto económico internacional. Regresamos a las 15 horas con el bloque 3 sobre fondos generacionales, moda o tendencia. Es la pregunta a responder. Les esperamos.